pivot your neck and participate. Okay. Please take your seat. Okay, great. So thank you so much for joining our session, Whose Language, Whose Model. We're really upset that we can't be joined by our facilitator, our main organizer, Marlena Wisniak from the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, but no worries, we have an incredible session planned. And so to kick us off, my name is Alia Bhatia. I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a Washington-based not-for-profit, nonpartisan group. And today we have an incredible set of speakers who are really going to contend with this question of what does it mean to foster more meaningful multi-stakeholder participation in the development of AI, really across the life cycle of AI, when we're thinking about AI systems from conception and design to development to deployment and post-deployment as well. And we're going to start us off with a few sort of provocations and thoughts from our esteemed panelists. And then, as I mentioned, sort of kick it off to the group to think deeper about either ways we can foster that participation, but also maybe initiatives that in the room led by organizations you represent to sort of learn and enable that sort of cross-sector collaboration. And we'll also be inviting folks to report out after each of you sort of break out into this discussion. So please, amongst yourself, choose a few facilitators. Will be joining the groups as well to sort of see these questions. But before we start, why is this important? As we know, large language models and other AI systems are already being procured and used and sort of deployed in multiple settings, in public and private spaces. But more often than not, these conversations are being led and sort of centralized in the global north, in industry or G2G, government to government spaces. And that loses out on a lot of very valuable expertise, both from civil society and sort of policy experts, but also a lot of experts who are the most experts and people who are the most affected by the deployment of AI technologies. And so today we want to talk and spotlight a couple of initiatives that are bringing these groups into the conversation. What are some of the considerations we need to have in mind when we try to foster this meaningful participation? Towards what end are we moving? What is participation for, and how do we ensure that it's not a box checking exercise? And then what are policy and regulatory approaches to actually incentivize or put teeth to these efforts by either giving more standards for companies to adhere to and model developers to adhere to, but also enforcement mechanisms when they to ensure that when they don't, we have actual means to make them do so. So first, I'll introduce our panelists and invite them also to give a more in-depth introduction of themselves. To my right, we have Jhalak Kakkar, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University in Delhi. Jhalak has written, co-written, and also steered the development of a lot of resources of evaluating policy approaches to the governance of AI systems, but also thinking critically about, sort of stress testing these claims of who these AI systems sort of purport to help and in what contexts. And then next to her, we have Dhanraj Thakur, who is the sort of inaugural professor and director of the Emerging Technology Initiative at the George Washington University, and I believe the George Washington University Law School as well. So Jhalak, I'm going to start off with you to talk us through a few of the sort of policy or regulatory approaches where we are seeing meaningful participation sort of come up, and what these governance mechanisms, either through laws and policy, but also soft laws, voluntary commitments, etc. What do they incentivize? How have they been effective? And where are we left wanting more?
Yeah, Um, you know, in any new space, there's always a trajectory of figuring out what is relative consensus and where can we start to build norms that then build into sort of voluntary commitments, other forms of soft law, which start to then get codified in the shape of standards, in the shape of regulation, in the shape of other sort of international binding commitments. And there's always like a process and trajectory to do that. I think there's value in having multi-stakeholder conversations to start to build that consensus. But if we look at past experience with, say, social media regulation, I think we stayed in the let innovation happen, we're building consensus phase for too long. And I think there needs to be a cutoff point where we start moving beyond voluntary commitments to more hard forms of law, whether that's standards, whether that's sort of laws and regulations, or even which may not even mandate particular sort of outcomes, but may mandate processes at this stage, right? What are processes you need to integrate into the design and deployment of these systems so that we are able to at least surface what are the kinds of harms and challenges that we are seeing. Because if we don't make that shift over the period of the next couple of years from voluntary commitments into harder, more structured forms of regulation, we will sort of may see a repetition of what we've seen with the history of social media, where platforms ran free. There was no mechanism to hold them truly accountable to these commitments that they were repeatedly making in various forums. And we've seen the sort of mess that we have sort of landed up in because of that. So yeah, I think I'll pause here and then we can come back for more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to pause because I think um, it's a good sort of where we've come from. And now, when we're trying to build towards a vision of more people to have a role in the development or in the development of these new technologies, but also truly saying when it doesn't work for them, what does it look like to have the seat at the table? I'd like to bring Dhanraj into that part. What are some of the effective characteristics of meaningful external and multi-stakeholder participation? What are we talking about when we're saying we need to have a voice in the conversation, and who is this we?
Great. Thank you, Alia. So also thanks to the organizers to provide a space for this kind of discussion. So when we talk about meaningful participation and how we can effectively engage communities in the design, deployment, and evaluation around AI models, I think it's important to recognize that this is an issue, a problem that is not new. In the same way Jellic was referring to like lessons from the social media regulation world, there are lessons that we can draw from when you look at other technological interventions and how their practitioners and policymakers have sought to include wider communities, targeted communities, and so on in these questions. What ultimately emerges, though, when you look at these past lessons, is a question about power. It's a question about the distribution of power. When we talk about participation and collaboration and building partnerships with communities, with different constituencies, we're in effect talking about how power is distributed and what kinds of decisions are being made by who. For a long time, when you look at the field of international development and how countries in the global south or the majority world would put in place different kinds of development projects, what emerged from those kinds of lessons was characterized by a scholar named Chambers back based on his work in the 1890s, is in the supply chain, in the thought process, putting them first, starting with their needs, and their concerns. That can ultimately mean, for example, communities, target groups, defining what technology use cases are best for them, which is the reverse of what we see now, where frontier model companies deploy models with the idea of let people figure out what the use case is best for them after the fact, or evaluations after the fact. Another thing that emerged from a lot of that work around effective community participation is recognizing that communities actually have a lot of expertise to analyze their local context and understand what's really needed. And so when we think about the development of language models, for example, how they're developed, what kind of specific contexts, what kinds of linguistic concerns should be included in development of these models, that is often where that kind of analysis can lie. So that's kind of a high level, but I just wanted to bring in this issue that there's a lot of debate and research around this kind of what are the mechanisms of effective participation that precedes AI, but we can learn from that without necessarily needing to start from scratch.
No, I think that's really helpful level setting to begin with, because I think sometimes in the AI policy conversation, there is a lot of ahistoricizing going on of like acting like the development of these technologies necessitate, so complex and like uses this new jargon and necessitates only technical experts in the room. Although we've been here before, we've built other sort of incredibly complex privacy enhancing technologies, for example, with journalists and human rights